Before we start, if you're enjoying these conversations, please make sure that you like or subscribe to Cleaning Up. It really helps other people to find us. Cleaning Up is brought to you by Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation. Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. One of the characteristics that unites almost all of the guests so far on Cleaning Up is optimism in one form or another. The belief that by working hard and working together, we can make the world a better place. And yet we hear that so many young people are pessimistic about climate change, pessimistic about the world. My guest today on Cleaning Up has assembled the largest group of students optimistic about the world, engaged and working on climate solutions. Meredith Adler is the Executive Director of Student Energy. Let's welcome her to Cleaning Up and find out more. So, Meredith, thank you so much for joining us here on Cleaning Up. Where are you calling in from today?
I'm calling in from Squamish, British Columbia on the west coast of Canada.
Very nice, very nice. Let's start, if we might, with a thumbnail of yourself in your own words. We've got this enormously knowledgeable audience, but they don't know everybody. So who are you and what do you do?
Yes, I'm Meredith Adler. I'm the Executive Director of Student Energy Global. So I run the largest organization working on youth capacity building and training in energy and climate.
Now we're going to get into what Student Energy does, but as a starting point, maybe you've just got back from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Now our paths didn't cross there. What were you up to?
So I was there doing a few different things. We had 3 different research pieces we were launching and talking to governments about our global youth energy outlook and the green skills piece, as well as the youth impact framework. So a lot of what we're doing in government engagement right now is actually helping people to understand what meaningful work with young people looks like and how do you really meaningfully bring young people into the space and help them get established as entrepreneurs or within their career in energy and climate. So that's a lot of what we bring to the space right now. The other exciting thing I was doing is our International Student Energy Summit, which you've been at before, is coming back in 2023 and being hosted by NYU Abu Dhabi in the UAE. So that team came with us and did a lot of work talking to the COP folks, meeting the people who will be running COP28 and basically working to align everything that they're doing with what's happening at COP next year. So the other fun part of my role, besides talking to funders and governments, is really being head coach at Student Energy. And so that was an opportunity to work with one of our top teams, and that was really fun.
How many days were you there for the full 2 weeks or only part of it?
No, I just went for 1 week. I just went for the first week, and then we had another team there for second week to see the final bits through.
And did you get out of the blue zone? Did you do any snorkeling or anything else while you were there?
This is a funny story. I am known for ensuring that people make the most of their time working together because we have staff in 5 different countries, plus students in 130. So I wasn't willing to let people have the Sunday off, but compromised and held meetings on a boat and some kind of snorkeling in between meetings with each other. So there was a little bit of snorkeling and a picturesque meeting location that I got people into.
Well, I'm glad it wasn't just me, because I will confess that on the Saturday, Joe organized, Joe, whom you've met or you've worked with to set up this session, organized for me to go also on a boat and do a bit of snorkeling with some colleagues from who were involved in COP, and we sort of snuck off feeling very guilty, but we did loads of work on the boat. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. Sometimes you have to pepper some fun and some sightseeing in with all the meetings.
But it was fun, but what was also it was also important in the sense that I have been there before. I've been there decades ago to Sharm el-Sheikh, and also we went down to Ras Mohammed, which is the nature reserve, and I can tell you the coral is in much worse state than it was. I can also tell you that it's not climate change, because I've seen very good coral in the Red Sea, elsewhere fairly recently. And it all seems to be local stressors. It all seems to be pollution related, too many boats, too many tourists, too much being dumped in the Red Sea, sadly.
I mean, that's really interesting context, because I did notice it looks like the coral was in bad shape, frankly. But it's always hard to say which impacts are these. And I think, I mean, that's an interesting critique of COP in itself is, there's so many people going to these areas. Is that sustainable to keep hosting this mass conference? But then at the same time, how efficient is it to have everyone you need to meet with in the same space for 2 weeks? So it's an interesting place to be.
The question about whether how many tens of thousands of people should fly to COPs is a good one. What I will say is that the boat trip that I was on, there was only a small number of us, a small group of us from COP. The overwhelming majority were Russians. The overwhelming majority. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that too around the restaurants with people from COP, and then really large parties from Russia and Israel. Actually, there were lots in there.
Now, Meredith, it's fantastic to see you looking so well, and your I've heard your most recent news, which is that you will actually be moving on from student energy, and we could chat about all sorts of things. We'll get back to that, but the audience at this point is thinking, I don't really know what student energy does. So you've hinted at it with some of the things that you were doing at COP, but can you talk us through what is student energy, and what are the how did you set it up? How have you been leading it?
Yeah, so student energy is a movement of 50,000 youth in 130 countries who are creating the next generation of energy leaders. And so what we do on the day-to-day is actually two pieces. So one is that we focus a lot on skill and capacity building for young people. So we have programs that go everything from what is a solar panel to getting your first job or starting your first business. And we really focus in the capacity building place on really what is it that brings more people into the fold, and how do we do that at scale? I think a lot of climate training, or a lot of things in the past, definitely other generations have had climate or energy be really niche, be really competitive. And what we know is that we need way more climate and energy people and workers. And so what we're really focused on is how do you do it at scale, and how do you bring in people who didn't make it here in the past? So systemically excluded people, folks who may not have had the privilege to go to the right universities, those types of things. So all of our programming is free. And all of it is based on how do we take this level of ambition that young people have and really turn that into a concrete skill set that can do something, that can organize their community, that can start a business, that can really contribute to a company. So that's one end of student energy. The other end of student energy is what we call Space for Youth. And so that's where we work with governments, companies, and organizations on how do you do meaningful youth engagement? How do you really bring young people in as part of your team in solving these problems and facilitate the intergenerational work that needs to happen? And a lot of that takes place through research reports. We run youth advisory councils for C-suites of organizations. A lot of pretty in-depth facilitation that crosses those bounds between getting young people a really good learning experience, but then also actually working with leadership on energy and climate to really show that young people aren't just the scary force that's going to protest you. They actually are people who really want to dive in and solve these problems with you. And we just need to create better forums really for that to be able to happen.
I've really enjoyed my interactions with student energy because it is essentially an optimistic and a problem-solving kind of platform. It's not focused on, as you say, just protesting and sort of gluing yourselves to things. It's actually about those two things, which is giving the students the skills and then also creating environments where they can be integrated into workforces or into civic society or whatever. So it's a great force for good in my view. Just repeat the numbers. You said 50,000 in how many countries?
In 130 different countries have been part of it so far.
And in those 130 countries, you work with universities. Are those? Do you have chapters in universities? How does it work in the kind of on the ground?
Yeah, we have a complex network. So we have chapters in universities. So we have just over 50 chapters globally now. So those are all over the world, and those are hosted at universities. very much young people bringing others into the fold. So we're hosting events, doing educational pieces, research opportunities, and small projects. So that is one way people are involved. We have a fellowship program that hosts a few hundred people every year, that they do a project over 10 months. So it's all based on getting people their first project. And so often those folks are at university, but they don't have to be. And then we have a career training program, which really gets people their first internship-like experience. It's an energy intensive over 4 months. And then our guided projects program provides funding and coaching and mentorship for young people to do their first solar project, energy efficiency project, clean cooking. That's all about kind of creating our next entrepreneurs. So those are our different ways that people are involved in all 130 countries. It doesn't always make sense for there to be a chapter in a university. There's plenty of places where school clubs are not very common, or there's not really the infrastructure for that, or maybe it costs a lot of money to have a club at a school. So we have a lot of different methods. And then our big event, which we keep alluding to, is the International Student Energy Summit. And that's actually where student energy came from. And so I didn't actually found the summit. I took over in 2015, but the summit started back in 2009. And it's a pretty interesting story. The summit started in Calgary, Alberta, because students there were actually working in the oil and gas industry, going to school there, but really wanting to talk about climate change and sustainability, and finding that nobody wanted to have that conversation. And I think in Calgary in 2009, people in boardrooms were careful if they said the word climate change. And so, these students decided that that wasn't good enough, and they decided to host their own international summit and brought together about 350 students from 40 countries, and then a lot of the top speakers on energy at the time, and really created this magical environment where these young people thought they could do it. They had access to the older generations that were thinking the way they were, and that opportunity for collaboration. And that really spearheaded our first generation of entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs into the world of energy. And then because it was such a success, hence kept going, tried it again in 2011. That one was bigger and better. From there, the organization rolled forward, initially just around these summits that were really launching people in a new way. And then in 2014, started having staff. And then in 2015, we really sat down and said, okay, what's the theory of change on this? This can be bigger than these summits. And that's when we founded the Chapters program and started doing Space for Youth, and really dissected what the success stories were from those summits. What was it that young people were getting from that, and thought about, okay, how do you scale that on a regular basis all the time, and make this more than just a moment in time that a few hundred youth can access. So the summits now bring together about 700 youth from 100 different countries. So they're definitely the most diverse of their kind, but the network is much larger and much more than that now.
The typical I don't know if you call them members, but the typical student, would that be an engineering student, or how, what sort of subjects are they typically studying or have studied?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. About 50% will be studying engineering, but then we actually have a good amount of policy students and business students as well. And it's something that Student Energy has really prided ourselves on, is we really look for that diversity. And any time that we're doing an in-person event, that is a big criteria. Is we are really pulling together different people from different portfolios, really, because we know that more diverse teams end up as stronger teams. And a lot of our success stories from the student energy world come from these more diverse individuals who've had exposure to multiple different things. And students find it to be much more rewarding. We hear this all the time. Young people or engineers who just go to engineering conferences don't necessarily feel like they got something they couldn't get out of their campus life. Whereas young people who come to the summit and get exposure to, this would be my business plan, and this is how policy impacts the thing that I care about. It really creates much more multifaceted young people early on. And that focus on systems thinking is a big one for us. Both bringing in new ideas that people have not thought about, but then also getting exposure to folks with different experience, both at their age group, but also mentors who can show them, why it's important to be more multifaceted.
Okay, and then you got involved in 2000, and you said you took over in 2015, is that right? When did you first get involved?
Yeah, so I first got involved in 2015, right before our international summit in Bali. And so I was actually hired onto Student Energy to start our chapter program. And then my very first day, the then executive director, who was the other full-time paid staff person, announced that she was leaving, and that Kaylee Taylor, she's an amazing person. Everyone should look her up. She's in Geneva now. But she announced that she was leaving and that she was going on to work at the UN 4 months later. And so said, maybe you want this job. And what I didn't know at the time was, I think that was the only job. I don't think we had funding for more than one person at that point. And so it was a little bit of a trick, but it worked out. So I took over a few months after I joined as executive director, but as the only staff person. And then now we have about 40 staff. So it's grown quite a bit since.
Well, I was going to ask how many staff, but so you did not join as a student. You're not a sort of alumnus of the program in a sense yourself. You joined as a paid, as a full-time staff member, but then sort of left holding the baby.
Exactly. I actually joined as a target market, if you will. My story is a little bit interesting. I actually started university. I'm very focused on youth empowerment, but very interested in human rights. And I lived in Latin America quite a bit as a young person before I even went to university. I'd actually worked in the trades. I'd had like a pretty varied experience was me. And I'd actually only taken one class on energy policy. And then I was like, oh man, this is what I want to do. But it was my last semester. It didn't make sense to do another year. I was like, I guess I'll graduate and like figure out how to get a job in it. And then I ended up working at a think tank after school, and actually poring over new energy finance data was my first job.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I very enjoyed it. I was such a keener. And then I had heard about Student Energy, and then they were hiring for this person to bring together both the energy world and this international youth piece. And I was like, well, those are all my things. Maybe I'll apply. And then, but then as I kind of took over, it was very clear that, I was the type of person Student Energy was looking to serve, and then had a lot of nonprofit experience. So kind of knew how to put together the strategic plan and go from there in growing the organization.
Actually, it's a great story. I didn't know your sort of route to the top, route to leadership there, and that's part of what we do on Cleaning Up. It's about leadership, and the subtitle is Leadership in the Age of Climate Change. So it's great to kind of get that mapped out. You then took it to 40 staff. You said 40 full-time staff now.
We have 40 staff in about 5 countries, so they're on every continent, and yeah, we've grown 200% since I started. So,
and how do you fund that? Who funds those? That's quite a secretariat.
Yeah, my joke is anyone and everyone, but it's actually a lot more strategic than that. So we do get funding from governments, both Canada and the government of Denmark actually has been a big supporter, and then we have funding from philanthropy. And then we do work with corporations on energy as well. So we have a variety of funding, and then we work to fund the International Student Energy Summit as well in conjunction with whoever's the host. So there is a big diversity of a funding pool at this point, but it wasn't always that way, to be frank. It used to be just, when I started, it was just a few companies that were willing to give us corporate sponsorships, and it was quite a small budget. And so it has been a pretty heavy lift to get into a place where we have actually sustainable multi-year funding from sources that allow us to scale like this.
You have an advisory board, and I've been on a few calls. I regret that I've not been particularly helpful, I don't think. But one of the things that we've talked about on the last couple of calls has been this ventures program, which I don't think you've mentioned yet. And perhaps it's, good time to give me an update, particularly if it's going well. I'd love to hear about it.
Yes, definitely. So Ventures has been renamed, I think, based on your suggestion, actually, to Guided Projects. And then, but it's our entrepreneurship program, though, is the key piece. And it is actually going really well. So the government of Canada has actually recently given us a good initial investment. And so we're doing these projects with Indigenous communities in Canada quite a bit, as well as a few others. And then soon to be announced, we'll have a bigger expansion of that throughout Africa and Latin America. And so it is going well. And what the program is an initial grant funding for young people. So between kind of $10,000 and $30,000, as well as 2 years of coaching and mentorship to get their first major energy project off the ground, so that they're ready to become entrepreneurs, so that they have the know-how to do solar installations or do an energy efficiency project or a clean cooking project. And so the idea was born many years ago. Actually, we could see the fact that, one thing that was really hindering young entrepreneurs was that you had to go over here for your money, and you had to go over here for your mentorship, you had to go over here for your training. And people were wasting a lot of time basically trying to scramble all the pieces together, but student energy wasn't in a position to necessarily fix that. But then as we've gotten going with our capacity building, as we've shown people, look, it really makes a difference if you put all this together. We've finally been able to say, yeah, this is something we can do, and do that first acceleration piece. So it's going well. The projects are getting off the ground. Solar panels are going up, things are getting built. And so that's been really exciting. And it continues, and there's a ton of demand from young people. And I think it really is something that's going to make its mark in terms of increasing the amount of people globally who are ready to do deployment. I think that's something that's often overlooked, is there's a lot of incubators and accelerators and competitions around R&D, which is very important. We still need to invent new things, but there's very little support for people to get what we know works in the ground. And there's so much need for that, especially in the global South, but even, across North America and Europe as well. So it's been an exciting thing to get off the ground and say, this is going to be an important part of how we move forward, is really making this one-stop shop for people to build their capacity. And then I think the other thing about the program that's been exciting is it's really filling a big gap of the first piece. A lot of development funding, for instance, you need to be at a level where you can take in $500,000, $1 million for your project. Or a lot of incubators are similar. You need to have a certain level of business development under your belt. You need to be able to prove that you've managed a budget, all these different types of things. And none of that seems bad when you're designing a funding program. But what's challenging about it is you have all of these young people who have so much talent and so much potential, but they don't have a lot of privilege. They don't have access to the things you need to build up to get to that spot. And so this program is really exciting because it is actually an entry-level point for all of that ambition to start to really take hold of their full potential and get to a place where they can get into those other programs or get that other piece of funding.
It's a great program. I love it. Thanks for the update. I was put in mind as you were speaking there of another program that we heard about on cleaning up. I don't know if you know who Alex Honnold is. He's the climber who climbed El Capitan.
I'm a rock climber, so yes, I know Alex Honnold.
You're a rock climber.
I don't know him personally, but yeah.
So he came on the show, and the reason was, partly obviously I'm a fanboy of people doing crazy, scary things, but also he has a solar foundation. He has the Honnold Foundation, and does solar projects around communities, often where he goes to climb. There are indigenous communities or impoverished communities, and then by helping them to install clean energy and solar, actually help them to achieve their goals, whether those would be clean ferries in in Latin America on the Amazon system or wherever. And it's just, what's really interesting is different takes at solving not the same problem, but slightly different. So in his case, it's these communities. In your case, it's the early entrepreneurs and giving them their sort of seed capital and their first leg up. I'm a big believer in these bottom-up approaches, by the way. I see too many, billionaires want to spend 10 billion saving the planet, and they don't really know where to start.
Yeah, I think bottom-up approaches are so important. And then especially when you're working with young people, and that, there will be lots, I've had, honestly, but I consider to be some hilarious conversations with billionaires about what they think the solution should be to get more young people engaged or to build a workforce or what have you. And a lot of it will actually fail at the point of basically dictating what they feel people should do. And I think that's actually, it's an issue within philanthropy for sure, and in other spaces as well, in that, you know, you have a lot of people who are used to running the show, or used to having the solution because they understand their business and they understand their market. And it's not to say that they don't. But when you're talking about how do we get to masses and how do we get to community empowerment, how do we get to scaling, you know, unfortunately, the billionaire's life situation is so far removed that they couldn't possibly understand what's needed. And I think there is a reckoning to be done around, okay, who actually should be leading on what these solutions look like. And so for student energy, a big thing that we've instituted is a youth empowerment model in which young people always lead on what it is they want to do. And then we actually, as an organization, our whole thesis is to basically be the superhighway, if you will, of their experience, with people that kind of get things out of the way and help them move, as much as that's not a great climate analogy anymore. You know, but we are the infrastructure and the backbone that helps to pull the pieces together quickly so that the solution that they see in front of them can actually be implemented faster. And so that we can replicate it more at scale. And I think one thing that we're actually really good at is systematizing things. And it can sound very boring, but you know, all of our people and all of our programs and all of our staff organize projects in the exact same way. And so people are able to just plug in, see what they need, and kind of get going on the strategic plan of what needs to happen. And but it's all very community based. It's all based in, okay, what do you actually need in your community, in your geography? And really listening to people and helping them to kind of uncover the knowledge that they have. Because there are plenty of people who know how to install a solar panel at this point, but there aren't plenty of people who know how to make that acceptable in a community or make that business model work for where they are. And that's been a super exciting thing for us, is to be able to empower that. And now as our staff team grows, you know, we've hired on a lot of those young people as well to work for us and help tweak our programs so that they fit these different populations as well.
Tell us if there's any, can you share any metrics? So how many, because you got the 50,000 you refer to, is that the current sort of pool of people who are involved, or is that the history? How many have you touched in total? And then also how many have gone through that entrepreneurship program?
Yeah, so the 50,000 people is the amount of people who've been through our programs in the last probably 5 or 6 years. So it's kind of our current network of folks that we could call upon at any point in time is how I would put it. And so, and people who have also engaged in our learning in different ways. So that's the 50,000. I think, you know, the total network is a bit larger than that, probably around 60 or 70,000 people at this point. And we're harnessing our alumni all the time. And then in the entrepreneurship program, that program itself is quite new. So it's only about a year old. It's just getting through its pilot phase. So we're working with 5 different Indigenous teams here in Canada, and then through our Imagination program. And then we have about 7-10 more. So it's a pretty new program, but it's actually based on, a dozen, but it is based on the successes of the past. So we have folks like a person who's a board member for us now, but Brian Kakembo came to our international summit in 2015, and he was from Uganda. He was a business student actually, and some speaker flippantly said to him, well, if you're from Uganda and you care about energy, I guess you should also look at waste, because waste is an issue there too. And he's like, okay, well, maybe. But actually went home and worked with his engineering faculty at his school to develop a clean burning briquette for clean cooking based on street trash that you can find around Kampala. And so actually he now has a whole team of, I think, 200 young people who work for him, collecting this trash, building these briquettes, and a huge customer base on clean cooking, you know, from home. And he, you know, started at our summit, then went through another capacity building program, then did a program we had called Greenpreneurs, which was a similar funding piece, and used all of that to build his business. And then we have other folks who have done Rural Solar Mexico. We have more technology and development companies that have come from student energy. So a lot of what we see now with Student Energy Ventures and guided projects is based on these success stories that we were able to piece together through based on basically like, how do we replicate more of these at scale? I know I keep saying that, but that's where the lessons came from to make that happen.
No, I think the point about replicating and scale it's really interesting, because at the end of the day, we need millions, we need tens of millions of people doing these things around the world. But it's very hard. So many of these kind of top-down programs, whether they're funded by billionaires or by corporates, what they don't do is get that grassroots. And so they don't have any pathway to scale, really. But which brings me to another question, though. Most of the students in a place like Calgary, Alberta, or Imperial London, because that's where we originally met when you did your international summit in Imperial, most of them will not end up in Uganda. They might do a year or so, but fundamentally, they're probably going to end up working for large companies, whether they're large energy companies or large banks or utilities, etc. To what extent do you focus on their needs versus the needs of the developing countries, the very grassroots stuff?
Yeah, so we do a lot focus on their needs as well. And I think that's actually the other end of our skill and capacity building programs, is something called career training. And so that actually is, it's a 4-month program. There's an energy intensive at the beginning of it. And then you actually work in a global team of folks from around the world with a client on a project. So you might do an analysis of the electric vehicle market in Southern United States, or you might do, a financial model for a clean tech company that's trying to grow. So there's all different types of clients that we have for folks. And so we actually do that as well. We help people basically get their first thing on their resume. Similar idea to guided projects, in terms of the hardest thing for young people seems to be getting that first piece of experience. And frankly, learning some basic professional skills. I can't tell you how many people I talk to that say, oh, I'm looking for, my next young superstar. Who do you have? I'm like, oh, these ones are like, oh, they haven't had a year of work experience. I'm not interested. I was like, well, what would a year teach them? And they're like, oh, I don't want to teach them how to write an email. But actually that is something Synergy does. We teach them how to write an email, how to get organized, how to format their PowerPoints. And these things all really matter to accelerate that. So that is what we do for folks like that as well. And then our chapters program, our fellows are all about kind of getting people that skill set of being able to see a project through from start to finish. And it's not always about entrepreneurship, but I think, you've hired plenty of people, folks who can join your company and kind of pull together the different pieces are always more effective. And so that's also what we're teaching people. And then a lot of what we're doing is exposure, frankly. Even at, the top schools in the United States, in the UK, where have you, there are very few classes being taught on climate change. There's very little practical education going on. And I think that is something that we need to also contend with. It doesn't make sense for everybody to need to do a PhD. If that's going to take you 8 years from now to do undergrad to PhD, we are past 2030 at that point. You have missed a whole section of what needs to happen on climate. Whereas if we can be upskilling people faster and getting them in, I think that people frankly can do more. And so that's a lot of what we're doing as well, is saying this is exposure to all of these things you can do, because the university system frankly isn't catching up fast enough. Professors aren't exposed to enough. Not enough people know what these careers look like. And so what we really do is work on really getting young people to talk to other young people. There's a lot of events and things that can seem fluffy or silly, but really so many of those spark people to say, oh, I want to work in this, just like me. I had one piece of exposure to that in university, and then it really clicked for me. And then I think so a lot of it is about young people talking to young people and building the momentum on this. Our chapters are engaging probably 15, 20,000 people every single year on that type of stuff. And that's not even what we're counting within our network, frankly. And then a lot of it is having people have their first piece of success. There's actually a good psychological piece to this, in that before you're 25, your brain is actually still very malleable, and you can't really distinguish emotions from thoughts. It's an interesting time, but part of that interesting time is that if you feel like you experience success with something in that time, you're much more likely to stick with it. And so that is actually something we're really focused on, is how do you help people have positive feelings about what they can accomplish before that age range? Because if you look at the span of entrepreneurs in the world, the people who do a lot of companies, they all have that in common. They have this like, I can do it feeling before they turn 25 years old. And so we do really focus on that.
This is really interesting because, I've already mentioned that one of the reasons I've really enjoyed working to the extent that I've had time to work with student energy. By the way, I will say, I wish that you'd been around, or that you'd been able to help while I was building new energy finance, because you were talking about, sort of helping to, kind of house train students so that they were, easier to integrate into companies and so, I don't know how many interns and fresh graduates I employed during new energy finance, but we're talking about many, many dozens, probably more than 100 during the time that it was, it was just something we had to devote time to and energy, but we loved it. So we were doing your job back then, but now you're doing it. This point about getting students engaged, modeling what success looks like so that they do more of it. But the point about it being an optimistic and an engaged group, because most sort of discourse about young people and climate is around, that they're protesting, they're nihilistic, they are anxious in some cases to the point of mental illness. And then there's student energy, where they're just kind of getting on and doing all this stuff and helping to fix the problem that, instead of just being all rancorous about you grown-ups have done nothing. So why is it, I guess that you've sort of answered my question, which was going to be, are your students self-selecting because they're optimistic and want to do stuff? And then the other students who are not optimistic are self-selecting to go on protests and be morose? Or are you training them to be optimistic and engaged?
That's a great question. And I would say it's a bit of both. I would say the folks who are protesting and upset are not necessarily mutually exclusive for the people who are in our programs. There are some people in our programs who do both. And I'm a big advocate of the fact that, in the grand scheme of change, you always have that. You always have a force that's pushing and feels uncomfortable. And then you have folks who are coming in behind that, taking up that space and like creating solutions within that new area, if you will. But I think there are a few things. One is that, yes, we do tend to harness people who are a bit more hopeful, who are a bit more interested in moving those things forward. But I also think one thing that we do really well is we give exposure to the idea that there are multiple ways to engage. And I think, just like Twitter, maybe, I've worked with plenty of politicians, for instance, who are freaked out all the time about who's saying what in Twitter versus what the poll says about them or what have you. And I think that, climate protests can be a little bit something that gets a lot of immediate attention. It sucks up a lot of the air, but it's actually not the only thing that young people are thinking about. And I think that a lot of young people are really looking for those constructive solutions, but finding them can be a bit harder. And so, and frankly, some of what I'm talking about, like successfully completing an event or a research project, doesn't sound as flashy as throwing a giant protest, but it is something that is much more positive for a lot of young people as well. And so there are plenty of young people out there who are interested in climate, who actually agree with what's going on in the protest, but personally, that's not their space. That's not something that they feel excited to do. They might be a little bit anxious going to a protest. And so I think that's where we also come in, is like, there's these other ways to engage and giving a lot of exposure, but giving exposure to the folks who are protesting and then also who aren't, who all want to be part of this. And I think you'd be surprised to find out the amount of young people who are going to those protests, but who also are interested in working at a clean tech company or interested in doing like something in climate and energy finance. And I think that the media has really grasped onto this narrative of climate depression. And obviously many people have it. We deal with it within our own young staff. There can be a lot of climate anxiety for sure. Many of our staff are within this under 30 demographic. But I think by and large, from my perspective, it's more blown up than it needs to be. I think where young people really do struggle, though, is in a lot of false promises, a lot of not knowing what comes next, and a lot of feeling like the governments, the powers that be around them don't have the level of ambition that's needed. And then it's also interesting, though, to look at age demographics and look at where demand is coming from for our programs. And then, where these stories are coming from as well. Because when you look at places like the UK or the US, the average age is or the median age is something like 38, 40 years old. When you look at like Nigeria, for instance, the average age is 18, or the median age is 18 years old. And I can tell you that we have probably 10 applications from the Global South for every 2 that we have from the Global North. Like, we have a lot of applications from those areas. And you see this where the median age is really young. There is actually a big ambition to just like get going with climate, not wait for your government, not wait for the corporations around you, like get whatever you can to build your own solar business or to build your own thing and to get this going. And I think that's really exciting. And the more exposure actually that young people from the Global North get to those young people from the Global South who have this, like, I'm going to do it against all odds ambition, I find the more hope that can be engendered. And I think it's just important to think about, like, how much are we valuing young people? And that is, I think, what a lot of where this climate angst comes from, frankly, is that you see it all the time. You see governments that get elected based on a youth vote. This new shiny new face is going to make it happen for them. And then once they're in office, they stop listening to young people. They don't do what they said they were going to do for young people. And then young people get discouraged. And I think it is this vicious cycle. So that was a fairly roundabout answer to say, I think we attract a lot of hopeful people. I think we train them to be hopeful. I think we give them a lot of tools that make people feel more hopeful. But also, I think that young people are getting a little bit of too much of a bad rep for just being depressed and angsty all the time, when really we just need to create more openings for them to feel like they're able to do something.
Thank you very much. And I suppose I realized the moment I said it that I'd framed the question as sort of either being a morose protester or being a happy, excited and engaged student energy person is not. It's clearly there's going to be overlap. But it is a fascinating question because, I do see my own, my analysis, my understanding, all the work I've done says that we're kind of, the where we are right now, the trajectory we're on, is not this catastrophic collapse scenario. It's a very bad scenario. It's like a 2.5 degrees scenario. And there's everything to fight for to turn it into a 1.8 degrees. I actually don't believe we can do 1.5, but I think we can get to 1.8. But it's an incredibly vital battlefield that we have to be engaged in. That's what gets me out of bed every day. And then if I do hear that the young people are sort of have given up, or they think it can't be done, or they think it's much worse, and then that depresses me. That upsets me.
And I frankly find it very upsetting as well. Inevitably, every time I end up at some party late at night, some young person will come up to me and have some panic attack about how they're not composting enough, and they forgot to put the eggshells in the compost. I have to sit there and be like, you know what? Try your best to compost, but actually there are all these other forces at play, and that's okay. It's like, this is not the whole weight of the world is not on your shoulders. And so I think, so it's important to have those conversations with young folks. But I think that I do think that the media has blown it up more than it needs to be. And I think that it's also hard. I will say that from my own experience, we haven't talked a lot about what I did before student energy, but I will say that in my first job, I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, paid nothing, but got to go work in climate, and I was so excited. And then as I got into it, I was exposed to things that frankly were not pleasant experiences, that were experiences where I was like, oh, just because I saw these people were amazing climate leaders, which they are, doesn't mean that they're necessarily good people. And I remember that kind of opening up my eyes to what that was, and having to deal with that when I was under 25. I was in this emotional state of my life. And, that was a big reckoning for me of, do I even want to stay in the climate space, or should I just go take a corporate job that would pay me decently and I feel have a little bit more respect? And I think that's also something interesting to think about within this youth thing, is that, you and I have, and, many of the leaders that you talk to on this podcast have the benefit of time, can look back understand the history of how things happen. I mean, one thing I love about this podcast is I feel like I learn a lot about, oh yeah, the little things that work to make that big change happen. And you learn a lot about the incrementalism of change. And I think for young people, they don't have that time scale. They're looking at the last 2 years, they're looking at the last 5 years. Maybe they started paying attention when they were 15 and now they're 20, you know. And so for them, things do feel more dramatic and they are on these swings. But I think for the rest of us, there's something to be gained from actually being a little bit more patient with them and taking this with a grain of salt and being like, you know, when I was 17 years old, did I have the kind of life perspective that I would need to understand how climate policy change happens? And probably the answer is no. And saying like, okay, how can we be a little bit more patient with them while also still like producing signs of hope? And I think pushing the media, pushing others to actually like be more hopeful about this, because people will always be loud about being naysayers, but by and large, young people aren't willing to roll over and die on this one. Like they're very committed. And I think we should take that emotional commitment as a good thing, and also trust in them to be able to grow up, as all of us did, understand the nuances, that nothing is purely good and nothing is purely bad. You know, get out of the Disney phase of their lives, basically, and kind of get into becoming solutions people. And I think, yeah, it's all of our responsibility to guide them in being that, and be a little bit, you know, take it with a grain of salt when you hear that an 18-year-old is very emotional, because that's normal. And they will grow up and they will, you know, you have children, I'm sure you will get there, but, you know, they will grow through that. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure they have as many positive experiences as possible, can point to as many success stories as possible and say like, okay, yeah, we're going to buckle down. We're going to keep going and do the best we can here. And I think that is where I'm really inspired often by the Indigenous youth that we work with. We have a 7-Gen council. By our leadership team in Nigeria is amazing. Our leadership team in Mexico is amazing. And I think a lot of these young people who have frankly been excluded from the climate and energy space, their parents, you know, environmental racism, all these other things have like piled up, you know, have so much gumption for saying we're going to make this different. And I think, you know, if you ever want signs of hope, that's what I would point to. And speaking of student energy being a hopeful place, David Hochschild, the chair of the Energy Commission of California, actually had my favorite quote ever. He said, student energy is like the climate hope wedding. It's fun like a wedding, but everyone's talking about climate, and then everybody's coming together from all over the world. And I think, you know, the more we could have those experiences of people coming together from all over the world, finding that they share this value set, it's inspiring. And I think people just need more exposure, and the media frankly needs to talk about it more, that there are tons of great things going on.
I think that you put your finger on a couple of really important things. One is around the need for engagement and the need to be hopeful and the need to work, because at the end of the day, whatever temperature we're headed to, by working together and working hard and innovating, and that we can make it better than it would otherwise be. You know, even if we can't get to 1.5 degrees, it's still better to be at 1.8 than 2, and better to be at 2 than 2.5, and so on. So that the continued just wake up every morning and doing something is incredibly important. But you've also put your finger really on the unifying theme of so many of these cleaning up episodes, because with a very few exceptions who are incredibly negative, or even in some cases, you know, sort of contrarians on climate, but the vast majority of the guests, they've been working on climate solutions in their own way. And what I've been trying to do is to draw out the kind of the arc of change, not the news story, because the media, you know, they all want to go to COP27 in Sharm and talk about this negotiation, or what did Australia say, and who was, you know, who didn't do. But actually, there's also a longer term arc, which was COP15, Copenhagen, failure. What was it? No, sorry. Which one was COP21, Paris, the first framework, although it wasn't tight enough. COP26, Glasgow, loads and loads of net zero commitments, and we've actually capped emissions growth. So, I mean, that arc over the past, that's only been, you know, 10, 12 years. That's really important. It's really empowering to see that longer arc, but the media doesn't focus on it. And the young people don't have the perspective to draw out those lessons themselves because, as you say, they've got very short sort of experience sets. So you put your finger on exactly, in a sense, what I'm trying to do here. So I'm very excited.
I mean, I promote the podcast all the time for this reason. I sincerely do. And I think that's a lot of, what we're getting at with intergenerational collaboration, with the idea of scaling this now is really reframing this to everybody who works in climate and energy probably has some crazy story about how the circuitous path that brought them here. And now we need to get to a place where this is super common, where where it's like trade school, like we're just churning out people who can work in climate and energy to make all of this happen. And I think that's the arc that we're all on. But a big part of that is history, is understanding the history of where everything comes from. Yeah. And so I think that's why the podcast is exciting. And actually, that is also what's hopeful about young people, is they really pay attention a lot less to mainstream media, to be honest, but they are still paying attention. But they're reaching out to these more niche media platforms to things that really matter to them. And I think it's great to be producing more content that can really show, what great examples to emulate.
I hope when this episode comes out, I look forward to working with you to get the message out, because it's such an important one. I want to just finish by talking about what are you going to move on to, because you've now announced that you're going to be, after, 7 years, you're going to be relinquishing the leadership of student energy and going off to do something else. What's it going to be?
That is the question of the day. So I'm very much exploring options right now and talking to people about what to do next. I'm still very focused on building teams. I love building teams of people who can scale and do things. So it'll definitely be scaling something is my next thing. But yeah, looking at options in clean tech, looking at options in government, all kinds of different things at the moment. So very open to suggestion. Probably not a good time for us to brainstorm, Michael, but very interested in really actually pivoting more into the private sector, more into looking at how funds are flowing, because I think there's a lot to learn from these empowerment models, and I think there's a lot to learn from really our lessons at Student Energy on scaling and on scaling effectively and cohesively in a global environment. I think more people need to do that. So these are all the things I'm thinking of, but very much in my own exploratory phase and kind of joining our students in what I always tell them to do on how to have mentor conversations and figure out what's going on for them. I'm now having to take my own advice.
Listen, I don't know what you'll end up doing next any more than you do, it sounds like, but I do know that it will be something exciting and dynamic and impactful, and that you'll be unbelievably good at it. So I wish you luck with sort of searching out what it's going to be. I hope you also get to take a little bit of time off.
Yes, I intend to have a great ski trip in February, and we'll go from there.
A great ski trip is part of every single career plan in my book. Anyway, what can I say?
I mean, you should come visit Whistler. We'll do it together.
I've been to Whistler, of course. I actually skied in a couple of World Cups at Blackcomb, which is not Whistler, but just next door.
There's one in the same now. You'll have to come back and try it.
I'd love to do that. I'd love to do that. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye. So that was Meredith Adler, the outgoing executive director of Student Energy, with some deep insight into the psychology of young people and how to get them engaged in climate action. Next week, we'll have a special episode with not one, but two partners from Capricorn Investment Group, who, of course, support this show. We'll be joined by Yon Yadigoroglu, who was, of course, our guest on episode 89, as well as his colleague, Dipenda Saluja. So please join me at this time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is brought to you by Capricorn Investment Group, the Liebreich Foundation, and the Gilardini Foundation.